take a look at the chart here, and I think this is really telling and makes people understand what really went on. And so if we just look at the history, and I'm a technician, meaning I look at data sets to kind of
place. Even if Gareth is optimistic about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in the long run, his prediction for the top. Since late 2021, cryptocurrency assets have not been very appealing. In his interview with Michelle Keto, NSI Keto's lead anchor and editor-in-chief, Gareth has been predicting a significant decline in Bitcoin prices, even suggesting that it could reach as low as $1. Gareth's Bitcoin outlook is divided. He says that Bitcoin might fall if the U.S. economy enters a deep recession and the stock market falls, but that's just one point of view. Gareth claims that his bearish outlook on Bitcoin is due to the U.S. gloomy macro conditions, but if the Federal Reserve can pull off a soft landing and bring down inflation without plunging the economy into a recession, Bitcoin will be unstoppable. Bitcoin will really take off. Watch, share, and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this.
Predict the future. And that's really how I come to these conclusions. So if we go back to the 2017 Bitcoin bull market high, that was when the futures were approved, right? They basically debuted. So there was a lot of hype that took us up into that news. And then what happened? That was the high of the cycle. If we go to the first high in 2021, that was the IPO of Coinbase that debuted, and that marked that high. We had a correction to 30,000. We then go to the second high later in 2021, and that was the ETF for the futures, Bitcoin, right? And that marked that high as well. And so if you just look at that kind of consistency, that these big news stories that create so much hype create the top on Bitcoin, it makes sense why that would be the key level there, or why it would sell off on the news. Now, you can talk about GBTC, obviously selling Bitcoin. There was a lot of smart money that bought ahead of this news. GBTC was trading at a big discount, so it was kind of an extra bonus to them as well. And they're basically just at the point of taking profits. They know the run-up is now in play. They know that the general consensus of retail investors will be to take a little bit off the table, and that just creates this back testing, this move back to the downside. Now, just in terms of the 48 to 50,000 level, what's fascinating here is if we do a Fibonacci retrace, right? So we take the high of 69,000, the low to the absolute low of this bear market here, which was around 15,000 and change. Notice that the 618 Fibonacci trend line here, that's exactly the high there. And lastly, I'm just showing you how I kind of arrived at that 48 to 50,000 level. If we take the 2019 high, connect it through the lows of the bull market right here, we actually get that same level. And so when I get confluence of levels, that's really where I start to say, okay, this is going to be a major level of resistance. And sure enough, it was. Yeah, so what's going on here is, and you're right about the fees, right? GBTC is a much higher fee. So there's going to be a certain amount of money that is going to sell the GBTC and then eventually rotate into these other ETFs that have much, much lower fees. And I also think there was I mean, really, if you looked at how could you participate in your investment account at various brokers where you buy stocks, the only game in town was GBTC at the time, right? I mean, that's really all there was. It was either that or you go to the futures market or you go to Bitcoin itself on the spot market. So there was a lot of money that chased Bitcoin in, knowing that it would run up into the ETF approval. And it's just natural that you get this letdown where people say, okay, let me take some off the table here. Let me take my profits after such a mammoth run. So it's a combination of the two. You have the selling because of the fee factor and also just profit taking in general, which again, you can go to any asset class and you see these crazy runs. There's going to be a certain amount of profit taking that takes place. Should be sooner than later. I do think that within probably the next couple of weeks, it will balance out. My bigger fear, though, and this is the one bearish case that I have for Bitcoin, is that what happens if we get a market top in the S&P? What happens if we get a de-risking event in the overall markets, in the equity markets? And that then could also stall money from flowing into these new ETFs if people start to get scared. So right now, we know new all-time highs almost daily on the S&P and the NASDAQ 100, and that's great. But why is Bitcoin stalling out here? Okay, it's the GBTC selling of Bitcoin. That gives us that reasoning. But what again if we start to see the market sell off? And the one thing I'd like to point out to viewers here, which I think is really important, is that if you look at the past cycles on Bitcoin, so Bitcoin's topped out in December of 2017. The S&P topped out 6 weeks later in early 2018. If you go to 2021, the $69,000 high. The high was put in November. It was right at the end of December, 6 weeks later, that the S&P topped out. So I'm a little bit on alert here to say, okay, let's watch now 3 weeks. We're basically 3 weeks into since the spot ETF was. What happens over the next 3+ weeks? Do we see a stock market top, and do we see a correction there? And that would be another reason why you could argue that Bitcoin still has some downside to go. Yeah. So I think so. I think if we continue, if we just continue to grind higher in the S&P and the NASDAQ, eventually the risk on trade takes back over, absorbs all the GBTC selling pressure, and ultimately pushes Bitcoin back up. So it's really the one case where Bitcoin could sell off is only if we see an equity market top. Now, if we direct our attention to my charts here, I just want to show you guys this because to me, all the narrative is in the mainstream media is that the markets are just gangbusters. Everything's just going higher. If we look at this is all the sectors in the S&P 500. And if we look going back to 2020 or 2019, if you look at all the other sectors except technology, we've basically gone sideways. There hasn't been much net gain. But if you look at technology, this has been just a rocket ship to the upside. And that has carried the entire S&P, the entire NASDAQ to new all-time highs. And I do think that puts it in perspective of asking, okay, is this really a broad-based rally, or is this somewhat of a fluke where technology is just controlling the markets? And this type of chart makes me a little bit cautious going into the next few weeks to months. Yeah, so as a technician, I've isolated once we broke through 30 to 32, that's where that 48 to 50,000 target came in. And what we really know is that 30 to 32 level is right here on the charts. And we could see how it was the low of the mid portion of the bull market here. And when we came up to it under here, it was resistance, it rejected it, resistance, rejected, finally broke out. So in the near term, if it pulls back to 30 to 32, I'm a buyer at that level. Now, what I will say, and you ask me, well, what's the scenario where we get to 15,000? If you really saw a bad recession hit, and again, we know that there's so many negatives out there, but so far, to be honest, government spending is just insatiably filling those holes, right? We've seen the Fed, and this is an interesting stat, we've seen the Fed balance sheet drop by a whole $1.5 trillion from $9 trillion to about $7.5 trillion. The U.S. national debt in that same amount of time has gone up, $4 trillion. And so you have to understand is that the Fed has supposedly been tightening monetary policy, but instead the government has been spending at crazy breakneck speeds that has overcompensated. And that explains a lot of why the overall equity markets continue to push up. But at some point that breaks. And at some point we will slip into a recession. At some point the Fed can't avoid it. And that's where I do worry that Bitcoin could head back down. So if you see, to answer your question simply, if we saw a 50% drop in the stock market, I do think you'd see Bitcoin retesting that 15,000 level. Yeah, it might be a little less than that, but I guess the point is that it would be a big corrective move, a big recessionary move where what we would discover is that inflation is not necessarily going back to 2%, and it puts the Fed in a quandary where they can't necessarily cut rates as much as they want. And if we get into a recession and the Fed can't cut rates because inflation remains high, how do we even get out of a recession? I don't even think the market knows anymore how to get out of a recession without Fed stimulus. And that's the truth of it. People have to understand that is that you have basically a small percentage of the population. The wealthiest 1% have doubled, tripled their net worth since COVID. Everyone else has been struggling for the most part because of inflation. And again, it's a big issue where you've had this divergence, and we continue to see the middle class disintegrate. The poor continually, that group is growing, and the wealthy just get wealthier at the top. And it is an issue. There's no doubt about it. Most people already feel like we are in a recession. Right. So if we talk about in terms of, let's just say everything comes up Goldilocks for Bitcoin, and we continue to see risk on, and we continue to see money printing, which obviously makes Bitcoin an even rarer commodity out there. I think what you have to start to do is you have to start looking at the all-time highs at 69,000. And I would dare say that you probably are even looking at 100,000. Now, I still don't think that's the likely scenario here in the short term, but I do think that if everything continues as is with no recession, no risk off, then yeah, you're going to head back there, and it'll just be a matter of time time before that bid comes back in. Again, the more money in the system, people have more money to put towards Bitcoin. And I think that, the government, I don't know if they're discounting people's kind of observance of what's going on, or if the politics just don't even allow for it. But at some point, people are going to turn and say, listen, the dollar at some point becomes a depreciating it is a depreciating asset even now, but even more so at a breakneck speed. And that's where Bitcoin can really take off to the upside. I think it's tested 30 to 32,000 by May. So at least we're back down to 30 to 32,000. That's the big level. That's where I will start to buy pretty heavily at that level. And then if we do see risk off, I'll have to be monitoring that position, whether I want to just dollar cost average if it goes below that, or if I want to cut it and then rebuy lower. But 30 to 32,000 is my level. There's about as direct as I can get. Monster technical support, beautiful retrace from the $49,000 high. That would be absolutely where I start accumulating.
And then what kind of event do you think would get it hitting, going upwards again?
I think just that. I mean, if we really get in this scenario where the economy has this soft landing, maybe a very minimal recession, and the Fed is able to cut interest rates and start printing money, and things just kind of deteriorate in terms of the money printing again, then that's going to kickstart upside in a massive way in Bitcoin. And I do agree. I think the spot ETFs are a huge turning point. It makes the retail crowd even more likely. Grandma sitting at home, at some point she's going to start to see that she needs to put some money in Bitcoin pension funds as well. And it does start that upward momentum that will escalate as they print more money, essentially.
Sway has been giving bullish predictions instead of his normal completely negative and gloomy ones. Lately, especially since the ETFs were approved, he is sure that hundreds or thousands of wealthy investors will buy the ETFs, which will give them a lot of exposure to the leading crypto asset. He also says that Bitcoin's price will go up a lot once more people realize that the current financial system is doomed. Please share your thoughts and comments below about Soloway's talk. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post alerts to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.